You never forget the day the trucks stopped coming. Oh, the ammo trucks, they always seem to find a way, grinding up the muddy tracks in low gear, the drivers, faces pale and tight as they dropped off their crates of death. But the food trucks, that was a different story. It started as a rumor, whispered from one foxhole to the next, a low current of anxiety that ran through the company like a cold draft. Then it was a fact. The field kitchen was serving thinner soup, the bread was harder, the portions smaller. And then, one day, it was just nothing. The space where the field kitchen should have been was just churned up mud. That's when the mood shifted. It wasn't a sudden panic, not like when the Stalin's organs start wailing. It was slower, deeper. It was the feeling of the leash being cut. All that discipline, all that drilling, all that nonsense about regulations and proper procedure rate just evaporated like breath on a frosty morning. The high command might as well have been on the moon. We weren't soldiers of the Reich in that moment. We were just a bunch of hungry, cold animals, and the only law that mattered was the one in your gut. That's when you realized the official rules were a luxury for men with full bellies, and we were fresh out of luxuries. That's when the real economy began, the one that wasn't in any manual. That's when I became a scrounger. The first lesson you learned was that money was worthless. A fistful of Reichsmarks couldn't buy you a warm feeling. But a cigarette was a different kind of currency altogether. It was a piece of calm, a few minutes of peace, a tiny ritual of normalcy in the middle of hell. A pack of Junos wasn't just tobacco, it was a small fortune. You could smell a cigarette from 50 meters away, that sweet, acrid scent cutting through the stink of wet wool, mud, and cordite. And chocolate. God, chocolate. A single bar of that bitter, gritty stuff was worth more than a lieutenant's pay. It was a taste of home, a memory of sweetness in a world that had gone entirely sour. But it wasn't just the luxuries. The trading started with the basics, the things that kept you from falling apart. A pair of dry socks, salvaged from a dead man's pack, could be the difference between keeping your feet and getting trench foot so bad they'd have to amputate. I traded a full clip of rifle ammunition once for a can of salvaged tank. Grisu used it to waterproof our boots, to soothe the chapping on our hands, to fry up whatever miserable root or grub we managed to find. A needle and thread became a precious commodity. A popped button could mean a frozen death if you couldn't seal your greatcoat against the Russian wind. You saw men trade away pieces of their soul for a mouthful of food. I saw Bauer, a quiet kid from Hamburg, trade his wedding ring for a loaf of that black, sawdust-filled bread they called Kommissbrot. His hands were shaking so bad he could barely make the exchange. He just kept muttering, she'll understand, over and over like a prayer. That's what hunger does. It strips you down to the bone, makes you prioritize tomorrow over yesterday, no matter how much it hurts. And there were rules to this madness, an unspoken code that was more ironclad than any military law. You never, ever cheated a man from your own unit. That was a death sentence, not from an officer's court-martial, but from the men you shared a hole with. Your life depended on the guy next to you, and if you stole from him, you were dead. There was a cold, simple justice to it. But with men from other units, it was different. That was the Wild West. You'd meet in a shattered barn or a shelled-out village basement, and the negotiations were tense, silent affairs. Eyes darting, hands never far from a weapon. A good watch, a Luger pistol taken from a dead officer, a pair of decent leather boots, these were the high-value items. I traded a Russian watch I'd looted for a loaf of that black bread and a single potato. The potato was half-frozen, but to me it was a feast. But it was the look in a man's eyes that told you everything. When a guy was hungry enough, truly starving, his eyes got this hollow, desperate look. They weren't human anymore. They were the eyes of a wolf. I once saw a machine gunner from the 2nd Company offer his last machine gun belt cartridge a huge, heavy thing for a single potato. Just one. And the guy with the potato took it. That cartridge was useless to him, but he took it because he knew the value of what he held. That's the economy we lived in. A bullet for a potato, a life for a day. But some trades don't just cost you an object. They cost you a piece of yourself. They haunt you. I had this Zippo lighter. It wasn't just any lighter. It was my father's. He'd carried it through the last war, the Great War. It was heavy, made of solid silver, and he'd had his initials engraved on it. Give it to me the day I shipped out. For good luck, he said, his voice rough. "And to light your way home." I carried it in my left breast pocket, right over my heart. It was my talisman. As long as I had it, I felt like a part of him was with me, watching over me. But then came the hunger, a deep, gnawing emptiness that started in your belly and spread through your whole body, making your hands shake and your head feel light. We hadn't had a proper meal in a week, living on hardtack and thin soup. I heard a rumor from a supply runner about a sergeant major in a support unit who had got his hands on some real tinned food, not the usual garbage. Russian bully beef. I found him in a log bunker, fat and warm by a stove, a world away from the frozen hell of the front line. He saw the look in my eyes. He knew what I was there for. I showed him the Zippo. He took it, felt its weight, saw the engraving. He just nodded. He handed me 2 tins, 2 small, cold tins of greasy, salty beef. I walked out of there, my hands trembling, and I devoured one of the tins right there, crouched behind a wall, my fingers greasy, the metal taste of the tin mixing with the meat. It was the best thing I'd ever tasted. And then, as the fullness hit my stomach, the guilt hit my soul. I had traded my father's legacy, this piece of him, for a full belly. I still feel the ghost of that lighter in my pocket sometimes. I'd give anything to have it back. Anything. Another trade, a quieter one, was with an officer, a hopman who had a small stash of real coffee beans. Not the ersatz rubbish made from acorns and barley, but real, aromatic coffee. The smell alone was enough to drive you mad with homesickness. I had nothing of material value left to trade, but I had a small photograph of my girl, Liesel. It was creased and worn from being taken out and looked at so often. She was smiling, her head tilted, and she had a flower in her hair. It was my most precious possession. The hopman saw me looking at the coffee grinder, my face probably a mask of longing. He wasn't a bad man, just tired and homesick like the rest of us. He said, "What do you have?" I had nothing. Then I thought of the photo. I showed it to him. His eyes softened. He had a family back in Bavaria, a wife and a little girl. He looked at Liesel's picture for a long time, and I saw his own loneliness reflected in his eyes. He didn't say a word. Just poured a small handful of those dark, beautiful beans into my outstretched hand. I gave him the photo. It wasn't a transaction. It was an understanding. 2 men trading little pieces of the world they'd lost, just to feel human for a few minutes. I never got that photo back. I sometimes wonder if he made it home, and if he still has it. I hope he did. I hope that little picture of my Liesel brought a little comfort to someone else, too. That's the thing they never tell you about war. It's not just the big battles, the charges, the terror under shellfire. Those things are loud and they fill your mind with noise. But the quiet moments, the trades in the twilight, the slow erosion of who you are, that's what changes you forever. You start the war as a boy, full of ideas about honor and duty. You end it as a scavenger, your pockets full of worthless things, and your heart heavy with the weight of the things you had to give away to see the sun rise one more time. We traded our keepsakes, our memories, little slivers of our souls, all for the chance to live another day in a world that had gone mad. And when you finally did make it home, if you were lucky enough to make it home, you carried that ledger with you, not in a book, but etched right into your bones. Every trade, every hungry night, every silent pact made in the mud. It's all still there. You just learn to live with the ghost of the man you had to become to survive. You learn to live with the frontline scrounger who's still inside you, always looking for his next meal, always weighing the cost of tomorrow. This bag, this goddamn bag was my whole world, and it felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds even when it was nearly empty. It was just a standard-issue leather medic's bag, the kind you'd see in a movie, but the straps dug into my shoulder like they were trying to carve a permanent groove, a reminder of the load I carried that wasn't just bandages and morphine. It was the weight of every pair of eyes that locked onto me when the screaming started, that frantic, animal sound a man makes when his body is coming apart and his mind can't process it. They'd look at you, and in their eyes it wasn't just hope, it was a demand, a silent scream that you were the only thing standing between them and the darkness. I used to be so naive. I actually believed the big red cross on my arm and on the tent meant something, that it was a universal sign for don't shoot. That fairy tale lasted right up until the first 88 shells screamed in and zeroed on our aid station, not because we were a threat, but because we were a target of opportunity, because wiping out the medics meant crippling the morale of the whole unit. After that, the Red Cross felt like a bullseye, and I learned to move quick and keep my head down just like any other dog face. Every morning, before the sun was even up, lying in my foxhole with the smell of damp earth and cold sweat, I'd run the inventory in my head. It was a prayer and a curse all rolled into one. How many gauze bandages left? How much of the real sulfur powder, not the civilian stuff we'd bartered for? And the morphine, Christ, the morphine. Those little syrettes, like tiny metal tubes, they were more valuable than gold, more valuable than a general's stars. You'd feel them in the little pouch, count them with your fingers without even looking, and that number, that single digit, would dictate the kind of day you were going to have. A good day was when you had enough, when the screams could be quieted, when the shaking could be stilled. A bad day was when you had to start making choices, and buddy, those were the days that haunt you. I remember one time, after a push near some God-forsaken French village that was just a pile of rubble with a name on a map, we had a dozen guys laid out in what was left of a barn. The air was thick with the coppery smell of blood, and the sweet, rotten stench of gangrene already setting in. And I was down to my last syringe. On one side was a kid, couldn't have been more than 18, his leg a mess of splintered bone and torn cloth, crying for his mother, his voice high and thin like a child's. On the other was an old sergeant, a tough son of a gun who'd been from Africa to Sicily to here, a gut wound, the kind you don't come back from. He wasn't screaming. He was just staring at the shattered roof beams, his face pale and beaded with sweat, his jaw clenched so tight I thought his teeth would crack. He saw me looking at him, at the morphine in my hand, and he just gave this tiny shake of his head, a flick of his eyes towards the kid. He was trading his last moments of peace for that boy's chance. I gave the kid the morphine, watched his eyes go soft, his cries fade into a mumble. When I went back to the sergeant, he was gone. That's a trade that doesn't show up on any requisition form. That's the economy of pain, and the currency is your own soul. You learn to barter for everything. The army's idea of supply and what actually showed up at the front were two different universes. One time, we had 6 wounded guys stranded in a shell crater under sniper fire. Me and my buddy couldn't get to them alone, so I found an infantry squad, a bunch of grunts hunkered down in a ditch, their faces smudged with dirt and exhaustion. I didn't have extra men to offer them. All I had was the contents of my bag. I looked at their squad leader, a corporal with tired eyes, and I said, "I need 4 of your men to help me get those boys back. I can give you 2 syrettes." I saw the calculation in his eyes. 2 doses of morphine, a guarantee of a painless exit if one of them caught a bad one later. He nodded, just like that. We got the wounded back. It was a good trade, a clean trade in the messed-up arithmetic of war. Another time, we'd run completely out of antiseptic. Nothing. You'd pour water on a wound, and you could almost see the infection blooming. I traded a pack of cigarettes, not even mine. I'd taken them off a guy who wouldn't be needing them with a local farmer for a bottle of his homemade Calvados, this apple brandy that was strong enough to strip paint. We used it to clean wounds. The smell of that alcohol mixing with the smell of torn-up flesh. It's a scent that's stuck in my nose for 50 years. The guys would scream when it hit, but it was better than the rot. You did what you had to do. Some of the trades, they weren't with other soldiers. They were with the wounded men themselves, silent pacts made in the mud. There was this one lieutenant, a good man, caught some shrapnel in his thigh. The wound was filthy, and the infection was racing up his leg. The only chance, the only one, was to take the leg. I had to tell him that. He looked at me, his face grey, and he didn't argue. He just slowly twisted his wedding ring off his finger. His hands were shaking. He pressed it into my palm, along with a little photograph of his wife and a baby girl he'd never seen. It was warm from his skin. He said, "You make sure this gets to her. You tell her I was thinking of her." It was a trade. I take your leg, your chance to live, and you give me your most precious possession to send home. I took the ring. I helped the surgeon with the amputation. He lived, at least long enough to be shipped back. I mailed that ring, registered post, with a letter I stayed up all night writing. That was a trade that worked. But you don't always win. There was a boy, younger than the rest of us, a replacement who'd been with the company for maybe a week. A piece of shell casing had opened up his chest. There was nothing I could do, nothing anyone could do. I knew it the second I saw him. He knew it too, I think, because the fear in his eyes was absolute, pure terror. He was gasping, choking on his own blood, and he kept asking me, "Doc, am I gonna be okay? Tell me I'm gonna be okay." And I looked at him, this kid who should have been worrying about baseball scores and dating girls, and I made a trade. I traded the truth for his peace. I wiped the blood from his mouth and I said, "Yeah, son, you're gonna be just fine. You're gonna go home a hero. Just rest now." I gave him the last cigarette I had, lit it for him, put it between his lips. He took a shallow puff, and a little smile touched his bloodied mouth. He died a minute later with that cigarette still smoldering next to him. Was that lie a mercy or a sin? I still don't know. But in that moment, it was the only currency I had left to spend. The small comforts were the most valuable things sometimes. A dry pair of socks. A warm cup of coffee that wasn't just chicory and despair. A cigarette. Oh, God, a cigarette. You haven't known true value until you've seen a man in agony, and you offer him a lucky strike. The gratitude in his eyes, it wasn't just for the smoke. It was for the moment of normality, the tiny reminder of a world where a man could sit on his porch and enjoy a cigarette without someone trying to kill him. You trade a whole pack for a can of peaches, not because you were hungry, but because for 5 minutes, tasting that sweet syrup, you could be somewhere else. You could be home. And that's what we all carried, underneath the gear and the fear, homesickness. It was a physical ache, worse than any wound. You'd see a picture of a guy's girl back home and your gut would twist. You'd hear a Glenn Miller song on a shortwave radio and you'd just shut down, staring into the middle distance, a million miles away. We talk about food, not like hungry men, but like poets. We describe our mother's apple pie, the way the crust flaked, the way the cinnamon smelled. We talk about diving into a lake on a hot summer day. It was a different kind of trade, a trade of memories for a few seconds of escape from the mud and the blood and the constant, grinding fear. You developed a dark sense of humor, a necessary armor against the absurdity. You had to laugh or you'd go insane. Like the time we were so pinned down we were eating cold crations, and my buddy Joe looks at the can of cheese and ham loaf and says, "You know, if Hitler tasted this stuff, he'd surrender out of pity for us." We laughed until we cried. It wasn't funny, not really, but it was the only weapon we had against the misery. What did I bring home with me? I brought back a body that was mostly intact, which is more than most can say. But I left a piece of myself in every field, in every bombed-out town. I carried back the memory of the trades that worked, the men who lived because of a bartered bottle of booze or a handful of infantrymen paid in morphine. Those are small lights in a long, dark night. But I also carry the heavy, leaden guilt of the trades that failed. The man I couldn't save because I'd run out of plasma. The boy I lied to. The sergeant who gave up his morphine. You play those moments over and over in your head, especially at night. You wonder, what if I'd traded differently? What if I'd had just one more bandage, one more dose? You bargain with your own memories, and it's a bargain you can never win. The biggest trade of all, the one you don't even realize you're making until it's done, is the one you make with yourself. I went over there a kid, thinking I was going to be a hero, to patch up a few scrapes and do my duty. I came back with a skill set I never wanted to need again. I could tie a tourniquet in the dark, under fire. I could tell from the sound of a man's breathing if his lung was punctured. I learned how to look at a shattered human being and not vomit, to push down the panic and just do the job. I traded my innocence for that knowledge. I traded a piece of my humanity to hang onto the rest of it. And some days, when the smell of rain on dry earth takes me right back to that foxhole, or when I hear a certain kind of siren, I wonder if it was a fair trade. But then I think of the faces, the ones who made it, the ones who looked at me with gratitude instead of fear, and I think maybe, just maybe, it was a price worth paying. You just learn to carry the weight, same as that old leather bag. You just learn to carry it. You want to know what kept a man alive out there? It wasn't just the rifle, though you clung to that like a rosary. It wasn't the orders from some colonel 100 kilometers behind the lines. No, the real currency, the stuff that truly mattered, wasn't printed on any map or inventory sheet. It was the weight of your own pack, and I don't mean the official weight. The army had its idea of what a soldier needed, 60 pounds of steel and government issue hell. But the real weight, the one that either dragged you down or kept you standing, was the secret stuff, the personal treasures you carried right next to your skin. A small photograph with doggered corners, a letter from home so worn from reading the ink was starting to fade, A lucky charm your sweetheart gave you that was the real ammunition. That was your last, thin thread to the world you left behind, the one where people slept in beds and didn't have to scrape mud out of their ears. We all understood, without ever saying it, that these little things were our insurance policy. If the bread ran out and the ammo was low, you could always trade a piece of your past for a chance at a future. Let me tell you about value. Out there, value had nothing to do with money. A Reichsmark was good for starting a fire, that's about it. The hierarchy was simple. What keeps me warm? What fills my belly? What makes me forget, even for 5 minutes, that I'm sitting in a hole full of freezing water waiting for Ivan to start his evening symphony with his damn Katyushas? At the very top of that list, right up there with a loaf of black bread or a tin of real beef, was a simple cigarette lighter. Oh, a match would do in a pinch, but a good lighter. That was a tool, a comfort, and a prime trading asset all rolled into one piece of polished brass or steel. It was a tiny, flickering piece of civilization. I had one, a Zippo, American-made actually, a trophy from a long time ago. It was a gift from my older brother, Carl, who gave it to me the day I shipped out. He slapped me on the shoulder and said, "Keep the flame alive, little brother." He meant more than just the lighter, and we both knew it. I carried that thing through France, through the mud of the autumn, and into the bitter cold of the Russian winter. You deflick it open with one hand, that satisfying click, and spin the wheel with your thumb. The spark, the little gout of flame, it was a moment of control in a world that had gone completely mad. I remember one day, it must have been near Zhytomyr, the supply lines were a joke, hadn't seen a hot meal in a week. The cold got into your bones and set up shop there, a deep, aching cold that made your teeth chatter even when you weren't moving. I was down to my last crust of bread, my stomach gnawing on my own spine. This guy from another company, a big Saxon with hollow eyes, he had a loaf, a real, honest-to-God loaf of soldier's bread, the heavy, dark stuff that could break a window if you threw it hard enough. He saw me warming my hands over my lighter's flame. "I'll give you the whole loaf for that," he said, his voice raspy. I looked at that bread, and I could almost taste it, feel it filling the hollow pit in my gut. My hand actually started to move to hand it over. But then I thought of Carl, and I thought of that click, that little moment of normalcy. It was more than a lighter, it was a tether. I shook my head. "Can't do it," I muttered. He just shrugged and walked away, and I sat there, colder and hungrier than before, but somehow I felt like I'd held onto a piece of myself. You'd see it all the time, though. Men gambling with their personal treasures, their last pieces of home, just to feel human for a few minutes. A man would trade his wedding ring for a bottle of schnapps, trade a silver fountain pen for a pack of smokes. It was a slow erosion of the soul, trading away your future for a few moments of numbness in the present. But it wasn't always so bleak. Sometimes, the trading was where you found the stories, the human connections that reminded you that the guy across from you was just as scared and lonely as you were. The objects carried histories with them, and that history often mattered more than the object itself. I traded a pocket knife once, a good, solid one my father gave me for a pair of wool gloves. My fingers were going numb, and the gloves this fellow had were thick, hand-knitted probably by his mother or his wife. When I handed him the knife, he turned it over in his hands, feeling the weight of it. "This is a fine piece," he said. Then he got a distant look in his eyes. "I carried one like this all through Africa. The sun there, it would bake the metal so it was almost too hot to touch. Lost it somewhere in the sand near El Alamein." Just like that, this knife I'd owned for years had a new story. It had been to the desert. It had seen things I couldn't even imagine. It made the gloves I got in return feel warmer somehow. They weren't just wool. They were a link to a veteran of the Africa Corps, a man who had survived one hell only to be thrown into another. Another time, a kid, he couldn't have been more than 18, wanted my last tin of canned meat. He offered me a silver locket. I told him I didn't want his locket. He insisted, opening it up. Inside was a tiny, faded photograph of a woman and two little girls smiling. "That's my mother," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "And my sisters." We both just looked at that photograph for a long moment, a silent communion with the world we'd lost. I didn't want the locket. Taking it felt like stealing a piece of his heart, but I gave him the meat. He tried to give me the locket anyway, but I pushed it back into his hand. "Keep it," I told him. "You'll need it more than I will." That was the real value. It wasn't the meat or the locket. It was the shared understanding, the recognition that we were all just trying to hold on to something, anything, that made us more than just animals in uniform. The history of an item, where it had been and who had carried it, that was the true currency. And that brings me to the one thing I could never, ever trade. We all had one. For some, it was a crucifix. For others, a special medal or a child's drawing. For me, it was a letter from my wife, Anna. It wasn't just any letter. It was the last one I'd received before everything went to hell and the mail stopped getting through. It was still sealed. I carried it in my left breast pocket, right over my heart. I must have read the address 1,000 times, traced her handwriting with my grimy finger. To my dearest France, it said. I knew every curve of every letter, but I never opened it. Why? Because it was my final reserve. It was my promise to myself. As long as that letter remained unread, I had something from her I hadn't experienced yet. It was a tangible piece of hope, a voucher for a future that I could cash in only when I made it home. To trade it, to open it out of desperation in some filthy dugout, would have been to admit that I wasn't going to make it. It was a vow I made to myself in the deepest, darkest hours. I'd see other men with that same look in their eyes, clutching a small bundle of letters tied with a ribbon, or holding a small, smooth stone they'd picked up from the beach where they said goodbye to their girl. We never talked about it, but we knew. There was a silent understanding between us. You'd see a man reach for his breast pocket during a shelling, not for a weapon, but just to feel the outline of that one last thing, to make sure it was still there. Protecting that one small, fragile item became the most important mission of the war for me. It was a way of protecting the belief, the fragile, desperate belief, that a place called home still existed, and that I still had a right to return to it. It was the thing that kept me from becoming just another savage in the mud, from trading away every last shred of who I was before all this started. In the end, that's what it was all about. Not the grand strategy, not the flags on a map, but the small, quiet battles we fought within ourselves every single day, just to remember the taste of coffee and the sound of a quiet morning, just to hold on to the hope that we might one day be human again. You know, they always show you the fighting in the newsreels, the big charges and the explosions, but they never show you the waiting. That was the real war, at least for us, the war of silence. You'd sit in that hole in the ground, the dirt cold and damp against your back, and you'd just wait. Your whole world shrank down to the few feet of mud in front of your face, the smell of wet wool and stale sweat from your uniform, and the taste of metal in your mouth, like you'd been sucking on a penny. The air itself felt heavy, thick with a silence you could almost touch, a silence that was louder than any shelling because it was filled with everything that might happen. You'd give anything for a little action, just to break the monotony, but then you'd remember what that action cost, and you'd feel guilty for even thinking it. See, the chaos, when it came, was almost a relief. It was simple. Your body took over. You didn't have to think. But the silence was where your mind would turn on you. It was the enemy of boredom, a grinding, mind-numbing nothingness that could hollow a man out from the inside. We'd invent these silly games to pass the time, anything to keep our hands and our minds busy. We'd use spent cartridge casings, the brass still warm sometimes, and set up little targets on a ration crate, flicking them with our fingers. Or we'd scratch a chessboard into the dirt with a bayonet, using different colored stones for pieces. It was ridiculous, but for a few minutes you weren't a soldier, you were just a guy trying to win a game. The real danger was when you stopped, when you let your guard down for a second. That's when it would creep in. You'd start thinking about your girl back home, the smell of her hair, the way she laughed. You'd think about your mother's cooking, a real meal on a real plate, not this cold slop from a can. And then your mind would snap back to the mud and the cold, and the fact that you might never see any of that again, and that was a pain worse than any bullet. You had to fight those thoughts like you fought the enemy. You had to push them down deep, because if you let them surface, they'd drown you. So we learned to trade. But it wasn't like trading back home, not for cigarettes or chocolate. Out there, in that long silence, we traded moments. We traded little pieces of our humanity back to each other, just to remind ourselves we were still men. I remember sitting with Klaus, the kid from Hamburg who was in the hole next to mine. He couldn't have been more than 18. We'd just sit there, not saying a word for an hour, just listening to the distant thump of artillery, like a bad headache you couldn't shake. And then he'd start talking, real quiet, about the fish market down by the Elbe, the smell of the salt water, and the sound of the gulls screaming. He'd describe the way his father mended nets, his big rough hands moving so delicate. And I'd trade him a story about my family's farm in Bavaria, about getting up before the sun to milk the cows, how the steam would rise off their backs in the cold morning air. We weren't just telling stories. We were building a fragile little world for ourselves, a world without war built on shared longing. It was a kinship, you see, a thin thread of memory connecting us to something real. Sometimes the most valuable trade was the trade of silence for companionship. You'd see a guy, one of the old-timers maybe, just staring off into the distance with this 1,000-yard stare, and you knew he was gone, lost in some dark place. You wouldn't say a word. You just go over and sit next to him, shoulder to shoulder, and light a cigarette. You take a long drag, feeling the hot smoke fill your lungs, a tiny bit of warmth in the cold, and then you'd wordlessly pass it to him. He'd take it, his fingers brushing yours, and he'd take his own drag. That cigarette, passed back and forth, wasn't just tobacco, it was a ceremony. It was saying, I'm here, you're not alone in this. Each puff was a confirmation that you were both still alive, still sharing the same miserable existence. It was more valuable than a hot meal. And then there was the other side. The Tommies, or the armies, depending on where we were dug in. You'd see their campfires twinkling at night, little pinpricks of light in the vast darkness, and you'd remember they were just men, too. Boys, most of them. Just as cold, just as scared, just as tired of the whole damn thing. There was this quiet understanding that developed, an unspoken truce of survival. Some days, it was like nobody wanted to be the first to fire, to break that fragile peace. You could feel it in the air, a kind of tension that wasn't about killing, but about not killing. And sometimes, something even stranger would happen. I'll never forget this one morning. It was so cold your breath froze in front of your face. The fog was thick, lying low in No-Man's-Land like a blanket. It was dead quiet. Then from the British lines, a single tin came arcing out of the fog. It landed with a soft thud in the mud, halfway between us. We all ducked, thinking it was a grenade, but it just sat there. After a few minutes, one of our guys, a big fellow named Erich, who'd been a butcher before the war, stood up slowly. He walked out, his hands empty, and picked up the tin. It was coffee, real English coffee. He looked at it, then looked back towards the British lines, and he nodded. Then he turned around, came back to our trench, and a little while later he took a loaf of the black bread we got, hard as a rock, and he tossed it out into the same spot. A few minutes later, a shadowy figure darted out, snatched the bread, and was gone. No shots were fired. It was the most bizarre thing. We weren't trading with the enemy. We were trading with other human beings who were stuck in the same nightmare. That coffee tasted better than any I've ever had, before or since. It was more than coffee. It was an acknowledgement, a tiny flicker of shared humanity in the middle of all that madness. It was a peace that said, not today. Today we just survive. That's what the silence taught us in the end. It taught you to read people, to see the cracks before they became breaks. You learned to know when a buddy needed a stupid joke, a slap on the back, something to shake him out of his funk. And you learned to know when a man needed to be left alone with his thoughts, when the kindest thing you could do was to just give him space. You developed a sense for it, a sixth sense for the mood of the men around you. These quiet trades, these little exchanges of spirit and companionship, they were what kept you going. They were more vital to survival than a full ammo pouch or a warm coat. A shared laugh, a story about home, a silent moment of understanding that was the currency of the soul out there. That's the real story they don't tell you. The war wasn't just fought with bullets and bayonets. It was endured. It was endured in the vast, aching quiet between the storms, in the cold mud of a foxhole, huddled next to another scared kid, passing a single cigarette back and forth, finding a way, moment by moment, to remain human. And in that silence, you learned the most important lesson of all, that the will to live isn't just about your own heartbeat, it's about the heartbeats of the men beside you, and the fragile, unbreakable bonds you forge in the darkest of times. You looked out for each other, not because you were ordered to, but because it was the only thing that made any sense. That feeling, that connection, that's what I carried home. Not the memories of the fighting, but the memories of the waiting, and the men I waited with. The truck bed jolted and spasmed under us, a metal cage rattling over what was left of a road. Each bump a hammer blow right up your spine. We were a silent bunch, us replacements, each of us locked in our own private world of fear and a weird, gnawing excitement that felt already dirty, like something we shouldn't be feeling. We'd trained together, sung songs together, dreamed of glory or just of home, but that was a different country, a place that felt as distant now as the moon. The air changed first. It wasn't just the cold, biting deep into your lungs, it was the smell. It hit you like a physical thing, a thick, sour stew of wet wool, diesel fumes, cigarette smoke, and underneath it all something else, something rotten and earthy, the smell of turned-over soil and things buried that shouldn't be. That was the front. That was the breath of the place we were headed. When the truck finally groaned to a halt, the tailgate crashed down and the grey, flat light of a Russian afternoon flooded in, and with it the sound. Not the big booms, not yet, but a constant, low grumble on the horizon, like a hungry stomach, and the sharper cracks of rifle fire that were too close, always too close. We tumbled out, our legs stiff, our brand-new field grey uniforms stiff, the leather of our boots still stiff and shiny. And that's when I felt their eyes. They were dug in along the edge of a shattered village, figures more mud than man, their faces grey with exhaustion, and a grime that looked like it was painted on. They didn't say a word, just watched us. Their eyes were old, older than the faces they were set in, and they sized us up with a cold, practical disinterest that was worse than any insult. You could see it in their looks, the unspoken calculation. Which of us would freeze up first, which would get himself killed, which one, maybe, might last a week. I felt like a lamb being looked over by butchers who'd seen too many lambs. My uniform was a beacon, the sharp creases a confession of my ignorance. Theirs were caked in a crust of frozen mud and filth, shapeless and functional. I was an alien from a peaceful world, and I just landed in theirs. Trying to bridge that impossible gap, I did the stupidest thing. I fumbled in my pocket and pulled out a chocolate bar my mother had slipped into my pack, the paper still clean and crisp. I offered it to the nearest veteran, a guy with a scar running through his eyebrow and a stare that could cut glass. "Here," I said, my voice sounding pathetically young. "From home." He didn't take it. He just looked at it then at me and let out a short, harsh bark of a laugh that had no humor in it at all. "Home," he repeated, the word a curse. "You think your chocolate is for eating, kid?" He finally took it, not with gratitude, but with the air of a professor accepting a flawed thesis. "This," he said, holding it up like it was a nugget of gold, "is not chocolate. This is a warm place to sleep for a night if you trade it to the supply sergeant when his vodka shipment comes in. This is a pair of dry socks from a guy whose feet are already rotting. This is a lesson you haven't learned yet, and it might just be the one that keeps your guts inside your body." He pocketed the bar and turned away. My first trade. I traded a piece of my naivety for a sliver of his brutal wisdom, and I didn't even know I'd made the deal. That was the real currency here, not Reichsmarks, not medals. It was experience, and I was bankrupt. The next few days were a blur of terror and confusion. The manual they drilled into us back in training was a useless fairy tale. Real war wasn't about perfect rifle drills and parade ground formations. It was about knowing how to squat in a hole in the ground without the water rising above your ankles, how to light a damp cigarette in a driving wind, how to sleep standing up because the mud at the bottom of the trench was alive with rats. I was drowning in my own incompetence, and I knew it. My salvation came from a corporal named Erich, a Sauerlander with hands like shovel blades and a quiet patience that seemed out of place in all that chaos. I saw him looking at my pathetic attempt at a foxhole, a shallow scrape that wouldn't have kept out a determined dog. He just shook his head. I remembered I had an extra pair of socks, thick wool ones my Oma had knitted. They felt like my last link to warmth, to comfort. I held them out to him. "For you," I mumbled. If you could show me." He looked at the socks, then at me, and gave a slow nod. That was my first real, conscious trade, my socks for his knowledge. He didn't just dig for me, he taught me. He showed me how to angle the hole so the rain would run off, how to create a firing step, where to pile the dirt for the best cover. "Dig deep, boy," he grunted, the sweat freezing on his brow. "The earth is the only mother you've got out here." That lesson was worth more than 100 pairs of socks. I learned that the veterans, these grimy, hardened men, held all the valuable capital, and they wouldn't just give it away. You had to pay. The currency wasn't always material. Sometimes it was a shared cigarette, passed carefully from hand to hand, the glowing ember a tiny beacon of camaraderie in the deepening dark. Sometimes it was just listening, being a soft voice in the night when the shelling died down and the silence was even more terrifying. You'd offer a moin instead of a demand, you'd sit and say nothing, and eventually one of them might point to a bend in the trench and say, "Don't go round that corner too fast, Ivan's got a sniper that likes to watch it." Or, if you hear a shell that sounds like it's tearing canvas, don't worry, it's already past you. It's the one you don't hear that gets you. These weren't just tips, they were treasures. I traded my ignorance for their wisdom, my chatter for their silence, my fear for a little of their hardened resolve. The day I threw my army manual into a fire to help get it started was the day I truly understood. The book was worthless. Survival depended on the lessons men traded for a sliver of gratitude, a moment of human contact, and some lessons had the highest price of all. I remember Becker, a guy from Hamburg who'd been there since the beginning, a man who seemed to be made of the same tough, grey rock as the landscape. He was dead on his feet one night after 3 days of constant skirmishing, his eyes like ray-rimmed holes in his face. The lieutenant had just assigned him to a forward listening post, a lonely, exposed hole in Naaman's land. It was a death sentence for a man that exhausted. Becker spotted a fresh-faced kid, one of the ones who came in after me, fumbling with a Zippo lighter trying to get a smoke going. Becker walked over, his movements slow and heavy. "Hey, rookie," he said, his voice a dry rasp. "I'll trade you, my last match for your spot on watch tonight." The kid, eager to please, maybe even seeing it as an easy deal, just shrugged and said, "Sure, Corporal." He took the single match and headed out into the darkness. Becker collapsed into a corner and was snoring in seconds. We all knew what had happened. Becker had traded a tiny comfort, his last means of making a fire, for a few hours of safety, for the chance to sleep and maybe not die from sheer fatigue. The rookie had traded a night of danger for a moment of convenience. It was a stark lesson in the economy of survival. Your comfort, your safety, even your life, all had a price tag. The most chilling price was demonstrated by an old sergeant named Vogel. He was a grim, skeletal man who never smiled. He pointed to a foxhole near the perimeter, its sides caved in, a rusty helmet still perched on the edge. "See that hole, son?" he said to me one morning. I nodded. "The last man who dug that hole," Vogel continued, his voice flat and empty, "was a replacement just like you. Thought he knew better, thought the manual was enough. Didn't listen when I told him to reinforce the sides. He traded his life for his stubbornness. The price was paid in full. A coldness that had nothing to do with the weather settled in my stomach. It wasn't a threat. It was a simple, terrible statement of fact. The market here did not tolerate fools. The cycle continued. More trucks arrived, more clean, scared faces spilling out into the mud. And one day I wasn't the newest anymore. A kid, he couldn't have been more than 17, was trying to put up a tent in the rain, his fingers fumbling with the frozen ropes. I watched him for a minute, seeing my own reflection from months ago. I walked over. "Not like that," I said, and my voice didn't sound like my own anymore. It had the rasp of the veterans I'd first met. I showed him how to tie the knot so it would hold, how to angle the tent to break the wind. He looked at me with a mixture of fear and gratitude. I had finally accumulated enough capital. I was no longer a replacement. I had something to trade. But there were some trades that left you with a debt you could never, ever repay. It was during a sudden mortar barrage, the kind that comes out of nowhere, the whistle rising to a scream that feels like it's inside your own skull. I was caught in the open, frozen by the sound, my feet rooted to the spot. I was a statue of terror. Then a weight slammed into me from the side, a brutal shove that sent me flying into a rain-filled shell crater. I landed face first in the icy, filthy water, gasping and sputtering. A split second later, the world exploded. The concussion punched the air from my lungs, dirt and shrapnel whistled overhead. When the ringing in my ears subsided to a dull roar, I lifted my head. Where I had been standing was a fresh, smoking crater. Standing over me, brushing dirt off his tunic, was Hans, a guy from my squad. He didn't say a word. He just offered me a hand and pulled me out. How do you repay a man for that? There's no price for that. You can't trade a chocolate bar for your life. You can't offer a pair of socks for the split-second instinct that saved you. The debt settles deep in your soul, a weight you carry forever. You try, of course. You repay it with loyalty that is absolute. You give him the last of your stale bread when the rations are short. You stand his watch when he's so tired he's swaying on his feet, telling him you're not sleepy anyway. You sit with him during the long, silent nights, a shared presence against the darkness. You become his brother, because that's the only currency that even begins to approach the value of what he gave you. That's the ultimate, unspoken trade of the front. It's not about goods anymore. It's about a bond forged in terror and mud, a promise that you will watch his back as fiercely as he watched yours. And then, one day, you look around and realize the faces have changed again. Hans is gone, sent back with a wound that might just get him home. Erich is gone. Vogel is gone. The men who taught you are fading away, replaced by new boys with clean uniforms. And you are the veteran now. You are the one with the old eyes judging the new arrivals. You inherit the terrible responsibility. The debt you can never fully settle with the men who saved you, you now owe to the ones who came after. You have to teach them, trade your hard-won wisdom for their ignorance, and pray that you can keep them alive long enough for them to learn the only lesson that truly matters. How to survive this nightmare, and against all odds, someday go home. The cycle continues, and you are just another link in the chain, trading pieces of your humanity for another sunrise, hoping the price isn't finally, one day, your soul.